Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midweek Wire. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. We're streaming out live on X, YouTube, Rumble, Facebook Live, also on a BitChute Live, as well as post on Telegram and live at 21stcenturywire.com. Audio streams as well, iTunes, and all the major podcasting platforms, Spotify, etc. Thank you for joining us. We're going to have a very good but very timely conversation right now, especially in the wake of recent elections and the sort of disintegration of the MAGA movement in the United States. Plus, the war drums are beating harder than ever vis-a-vis NATO, the West, Ukraine, and Russia. And so what we have is the makings of a bona fide political crisis. And we're going to discuss that. The collapse of left-right politics right now in the West, but we'll be very much focusing on Europe. But the United States is absolutely connected to this picture as well. We're talking about the broader collective West, but the symptoms of this are very manifest right now in Europe. And to help with this conversation, we're going to be breaking this down with our guest, political consultant, international human rights lawyer. We're going to bring him up on stage right now. Arnaud Develay is joining us on the live link from Moscow. Arnaud, welcome to the Midweek Wire. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, Patrick. Glad to be with you.
So, Arnaud, before we get started, very important conversation. Obviously, there's a few political actors. There's a few countries we're going to be looking at as well. You also got inspired by this conversation from a recent debate, which you watched on YouTube. We've included the link to this. It's in on a Rumble channel right now. We'll also put that at 21st Century Wire. But just describe this debate on YouTube. Again, I'll drop a link for our viewers right now at 21st Century Wire. What it was about, who is involved, and then we're going to get into this conversation. Go ahead, Arnaud.
Yes, well, this was actually a conversation which involved a former UK ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, and I don't quite recall his name, but he's the leader of the Alba party, from what I understand. And there was a third gentleman as well, a long time political operators to be sure. And the discussion basically was, circling around the prospect for next year's Scottish parliamentary election and beyond, as far as the Westminster elections, if the schedule stays true to form by 2029, albeit the fact that Keir Starmer increasingly looks like a lame duck. But what was really interesting to me in the conversation was this sense of frustration in this. I mean, and you somewhat alluded to it in your introduction, facing with dire challenges, war and peace, economic collapse, prospect of civil war, or at least to the extent some people are making a political business out of trying to fan the flames of civil strife in a lot of European countries. The notion that there, except for the omnipotent, omnipresent, oligarchic sponsored center, the large fat center that absorbs everything like a black sun, all the so-called populist, sovereignist, progressive even forces seems to be completely in disarray. And we've seen this for quite some time in every European countries now, this inability to reach across party lines, across ideological mindsets, I guess, positioning, hardcore, entrenched position on what I would believe are secondary issues. But again, it's part and parcel of this party politics, this politicking game. And whereas they could basically, by consensus, come together on a platform and unite their forces, the system, as it were, the system that works these days by default and benefits from this disarray among some would say fringe parties. I don't like that term, but they benefit from this, obviously. And so, we can obviously look into discussing whether or not some of the leaders of those parties are very content to, not rock the boat too much, enjoy the benefits that comes with having a parliamentary representation. This is something that, should also be talked about. Obviously, it's very cynical. And, when sometimes we think about noble aspiration, we should be very much cautious. But my premise is that unless and until all those poles, those disparate poles, uh, reach out to each other across the divide, I don't think there's any chance in hell that the oligarchy can be defeated. When I say the oligarchy, I mean in every country of Europe there is this oligarchy that runs basically, the discourse that forges and shape, what is to be discussed, what is not to be discussed. And in so doing, the voters, and that's almost the direct mechanical effect of this, the consequences, is that voters are feeling increasingly turned off. And what we're seeing now more and more as a result of this theater, political theater, is that voters are the biggest party that's actually gaining in all of Europe, and I would say across the West, is the abstention party. People are just not concerned anymore. They're just tuning out, and that's bad news for democracy. So that's pretty much the way I would frame our discussion for today. Um, that's it.
I wouldn't disagree with you, Arnaud, on this. The phenomenon you described is definitely happening. The question is, why is it happening? And the other question is, okay, you can talk about that. There are some factors involved here, or let's just say economic and political and historical forces of nature that are at play here. Major tectonic plates that have been moving for decades in this direction. I'd like to get your thoughts of, I know you've thought of, you think about these bigger questions. That's part of your your general political approach to analysis on these things. But the last thing you said was the word oligarch, and this is a problem because as there's hunger for change and an acknowledgement of the collapse of the 20th century left-right paradigm, which ultimately we in America, you could say, inherited this from the French. Okay, initially, or Europe, modern West, the modern West inherited this paradigm in its embryonic state from the French Revolution. But here we are in the 21st century, and it's very hard to find any relevance. It's deteriorating very quickly. So your thoughts on that? And just before we do that, Arnaud, if you could just tilt your camera slightly so you're higher up on the frame, just a little bit.
How's that?
Yeah, so we're level. Yeah, but your thoughts on this? Why, Arnaud? What's behind this phenomenon? And is it inescapable?
No, I don't think it's escapable. I think we just need to put the church back in the center of the village. As you said, I mean, to the extent, this whole paradigm might have found its origin during the French Revolution. It bore on the condition of the peasantry at the time, who felt disenfranchised by a nobility which was completely out of touch with their what had been their traditional role for 1500 years in royal Catholic France. To the moment they decided to become uh, traders, businessmen, and adorn themselves with all the trappings of uh, you know uh, uh, enclosures in England, or those kind of frivolous activities, on their free time, instead of being productive and this kind of vanguard of society. The internal contradiction became such that all it took was Probably some outside forces as well. The bank, I would say, was very responsible for what happened in France in the late 18th century. And this is something that has characterized the right-left paradigm for the last 200 and change years. But added with the layers of the dialectical thinking process, born out of Marxism, because all the natural state of nature of the peasants was altered dramatically and fundamentally, structurally by the Industrial Revolution. And so we saw it in England, we saw it in many countries, in Germany. And Germany was actually the forerunner of the Industrial Revolution. And so a lot of people became alienated, and started being forced to move from this kind of harmonious lifestyle, paced by seasons, to a kind of unnatural, alienating, industrial city dwelling status, which has been characterized and rendered beautifully by the works of Charles Dickens, obviously in England, to name but him in England, and like by people like Émile Zola and the likes of books like Germinal and Victor Hugo, and so this is something that for many, many, many years, was really clearly identified. It was the exploited class versus the exploiters, and and the bankers behind them, obviously, although they were not really talked about as much as they are being identified today, because we moved from a economic model of industrial production and export to that of a pure financial type model. So it's all very abstract today. We don't even we've lost the know-how. We actually have to ask the Chinese today to send people to teach us what we used to teach them. This is the state of affairs. But suffice it to say that since what happened is that the end of the Cold War was really a watershed moment, because up until 1989, 1991, everything was still pretty much, up was up and down was down. And then everything started changing in the 1990s and really took off at the turn of the century with the rise, the emerging, some would say the globalist. To be sure, there were embryonic groupings, the Club of Rome, the Davos was, under its former iteration, started in 1971. And but those people now have become so powerful. I mean, they have grouped themselves into investment funds, the Black Rocks, the First Street, the Vanguard, to such an extent that if we take BlackRock on its own, it's worth 6,000 billion dollars. It's crazy. It's more than the economic output, the GDP of the three most powerful, economically speaking, countries in Europe. So the notion of that, those new supranational entity, and I'm not talking about the EU as a commission, supra-federal state here. I'm talking about the bank, about the means of production. As Marx used to say, I mean, we should reread Marx today, because not everything is to be thrown into with the proverbial baby and the bathwater. Quite the contrary. The dialectical analytical process, described in some of the most seminal works by Karl Marx, are today more relevant than they've ever been. It's just that for a long time we assumed that this was going to be a struggle between capitalist state versus a popular democratic states,
Hmm.
some kind of experimentation with Marxist Leninism. But I would argue that the end of the Cold War was, in that sense, the worst thing that could happen, because it completely reshuffled the deck and prevented people from understanding that the next step of this class struggle, let's call it what it is, was to be the globalist versus those people that are still attached to the only thing that they've known to somewhat organize their affairs for centuries, which is the nation state. And so this is, I guess, the new paradigm that we're looking at right now. Whereas today, in many of those countries, we're still dealing with this far left, but frelated version of the far left paradigm. I mean, the left has completely abandoned the working class in favor of societal issues bearing on, gender and sexual preferences, and not to mention the green agenda. Whereas the right, instead of being the conservative, prudent approach to organizing the affairs of the state, making sure that everybody still acts within a certain moral compass. If anything, just to name but one of those traditional attribution of the right, of the conservative, those who conserve. Uh, they've completely gone berserk because of this border issue, which is brought
Immigration.
upon by globalism.
Yeah.
Yes, but the problem, and that's the trap, is that immigration, it's all a matter of quantity, it's a matter of numbers. But to be sure, if it's instrumentalized into a kind of conflict of civilization, Huntingtonian paradigm, we get into very dangerous waters here. And
Mhm.
so, ask yourself in the end, qui bono, who benefits from this? Certainly not the people, certainly not the citizens of any of those countries, not no matter where they come from, no matter what their religious beliefs are. They are all living and going through the same ordeal. They all aspire to prepare I wouldn't say for necessarily a bright, idealistic, utopian future for their children, but something that at least allows these children to have a decent, dignified life. And we're far from this being accomplished. If we look at the current state of affairs and the horrendous, the horrific disparity in wealth, and how this, the wealth is distributed by and large, and the speculation, it doesn't really matter whether you just arrived or uh, recently arrived, or whether you've been there for a generation. In the end, you're all in the same boat. And so, the challenge today is to find a somewhat of a consensual uh, positioning, whether you're from the left, as it were, or the right, whatever that means today, so that we can witness a kind of marshaling of all the forces. I mean, we are the overwhelming majority. This is actually the gambit. This is the card we have. There are just a few of them, and there's billions of us, literally. So, but how do we find the political formula that connects, what is presented to us as irreconcilable differences? I surmise that those so-called irreconcilable differences are entertained and kept and promoted on purpose to make sure that people are not even trying.
Yeah. We can go on a. I want to go on a little case by case with Europe, a little tour of the current leadership. But before that, just want to address a couple of things that you said. I will argue that the you rightly point out, Arnaud, that the immigration issue has been weaponized, and it's been weaponized in a very kind of basic way that we have seen it weaponized before in history. Not least of all with fascist governments. Nazi Germany comes to mind. They made that one of the sort of central pillars of the entire political their whole political movement, National Socialism, and immigration, and specifically or Jewish, um, the Jewish presence as well, what was used as one of their sort of main issues to motivate people, and it's usually done along lines of fear and hate. Okay, but we've seen it. My point is, we've seen this before. We've seen it in England. We have seen it throughout Europe. We've seen it in other parts of the world, but we're specifically talking here about Europe and the West. And so I will argue that and you've rightly pointed out as well that the supposed paradigm for the last 120 years since the rise of communism in the Soviet Union has been capitalism versus communism, or that, and those are the main extreme kind of ideological defining points for this paradigm that has more or less dominated international politics and policy and decision making more broadly for the last 100 plus years. So, but after World War II, we had a level of success financially, at least in Europe. The peace dividend was all of this, the social services that were rolled out in Europe, in Western Europe, as well as in the United States during the Great Society, Lyndon Baines Johnson, etc. So, but at the same time, there was a drive by the U.S. and its deep state to basically enforce this Western European pro-capitalist line and undermine left-wing governments with extreme measures, including staged terrorist attacks, Operation Gladio, and so forth, to discredit left-wing movements and governments. And the CIA has a pretty good record globally doing that. That was one of the main functions of the U.S. deep state during this whole Cold War period, and after as well, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. This has been the case. But the result of the success, being able to deliver these social welfare programs, and even though they have the working class right that's been co-opted to go crazy over immigration, they themselves are massive beneficiaries of these socialized socialist programs, in terms of income support, housing benefit. It's almost like seen as an entitlement, but they've been cultivated to form the new part of the new right. This became very evident with the Brexit movement led by Boris Johnson in the UK, and the immigration issue has been completely instrumentalized to really rev up the working class, again, in this case against Muslims or against people from from the Middle East or Africa. But the main driver of this, I would argue, two of the main drivers. One is NATO. NATO has been a main driver of instigating immigration flows, sanctions against countries by the U.S. and their allies, but also Israel's foreign policy lobbying in the West, which also drives NATO interventions, but also U.S. interventions. So between NATO and the Israeli lobby in the West, and irony being the Israeli lobby is funding the right wing in Europe to over the immigration issue. So they're hitting Europe from both ends. And so I see this convergence that's happening right now massively confusing for people. I think a lot of people have been instrumentalized to play a part in this, but they really don't understand what's going on. Because I speak to these people, they're just angry, Arnaud. They're angry, they're upset, they're afraid. And then that brings us to some of these actors who are now on the stage. We'll bring them up right now, and some familiar faces, which we can definitely go through and talk about them. But the first and foremost, we'll talk about Reform in the UK. This is a new party, supposedly a conservative alternative to the Tories. We'll bring them up here. Nigel Farage is their leader, formerly of the Brexit Party, former rogue MEP in Europe, calling for Britain to leave the EU. Behind this party, we see multimillionaires and billionaires. So, but they're appealing to the working class, Arnaud. So here's the paradox and the problem, which you've rightly brought up, is that it's this type of arrangement. We see the same right across Europe. This is creating a lot more confusion, and it's just a shadow. So the left to right paradigm, as we once knew it, working class trade unionists and conservatives, social conservatives on one side, everything is crisscrossing now. And so, I mean, I personally think this is a complete construct, Reform UK. And I think it's designed just to keep the inertia going which they started by the billionaire class co-opting the working class to be thinking that they're nationalists, i.e., social conservatives, but yet, and using really one issue, a single issue, immigration. No economic plan, nothing. Your thoughts? I mean, I don't know how much you've looked at this, and we can talk about the National Rally and AFD as well in Germany. But what do you think about this?
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's recall that the social policies implemented in the wake of World War II were also, I mean, this was not like out of, their out of the kindness of their heart. I'm talking about the owners of capitals or of the means of production per se. They just had to somewhat give some slack in terms of countering the message advocated at the time by the Soviet bloc, the Eastern Bloc. So they could not completely reveal their true nature, the one that we had already had caught a glimpse in the late 19th century in the days of Cecil Rhodes. So they had to put some water in their wine and somewhat dilute it and appear as some kind of moderate, as it were. But the first thing we saw following the fall of the Berlin Wall was those very owners of the means of production rushing to emerging markets like China, and then later on to Vietnam and Cambodia and places where you could always find workers who never complained, who worked, for a pittance and rack up the profit, and at the expense of your own former working class. And so what ended up happening over the last 30 years is an evisceration of the industrial base in the West. Everything that made people proud of themselves in as far as craftsmanship, in as far as being able to produce things and export them and develop a savoir-faire was completely obliterated for quick profit. And it's always somewhat I find it bemusing, although it's quite bad taste. But those very same people who today blame the Chinese as if they had stolen every intellectual property and all the patent. I mean, the Chinese, they worked their butt off. They sacrificed an entire generation to be where they are here. Uh, did they really take precautions in doing so? It's not for me to judge. I mean, from our own perspective, we could objectively point out to some abuses. But from the Chinese perspective, if they wanted to elevate themselves and elevated themselves, they did. I mean, we're talking about between 700 and 900 million people uplifted out of sheer abject poverty from the countryside. And all the thrift lifestyle at the level of the government there, savings was not used to. I mean, there were abuses to be sure with the red princes and all that, and they got their comeuppance, because when the party started cracking down on the corruption, things were pretty swift. Justice was meted out pretty swiftly there. But all that money was reinvested systematically, and they were implementing those 5-year plans. And we look at China today, and we just cannot help but feel completely mesmerized by what they've accomplished since 1978 and then Xiaoping's 4 freedoms. Uh, so this is what, basically a country that cares about its development and its own people and that has its head screwed up right is capable of doing at the scale. Remember, the 1.3 billion, the one-child policy, lot of structural obstacles. China, is not necessarily well opened up in terms of pathways, commerce pathways. So they decided to undergo a cultural revolution. And I'm not talking about the 1966-76 one, from a kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, that really looked inward for thousands of years, literally thousands of years, to a country that now is taking its responsibilities. And for that, they're being blamed. as if they were trying to basically take away America's mantle of leadership. And so I just find this quite, objectionable at the very least. I mean, those very people in the West. I'm not just saying the American, business class. You know, the whole Western business class. They rushed to exploit those people and to enrich themselves as if they didn't, weren't rich enough to begin with, instead of being responsible, instead of uh, maintaining this legitimacy, as the elites, per se. And in one generation, they threw it all away. And this is where we find ourselves in now. And so obviously this has opened the Pandora box, and a lot of demagogues have just emerged as a result of that. Now, you made an interesting point as far as the far right parties or the populist parties, whichever you want to call them, is concerned. And you mentioned Zionism, international Zionism, in the mix. You have to understand that those parties, let's say from 1945, I mean, historically, they were defeated. Their ideology was defeated. And so they were on the back heel for many decades, not even allowed to voice any kind of opinion because, in pure Stalinist fashion, we don't discuss with fascists. You characterize them as fascists, discussion is closed. And when 9/11 occurred, that's about the time, and the rise of internet and the ability for people to see what's going on the other side of the world outside of the mainstream media, we started realizing that, what had been sold as, the Bund inspired project of this poor people emerging out of the ashes of the Holocaust and trying to basically, rebuild. They turned out over time, the left in that country was completely, I'm not going to get into the debate whether there is left Zionism or right Zionism. Some people would say Zionism is Zionism, and in and of itself, it is an exclusivist ideology. I can hear that. But back in the 50s and 60s, the way the project was sold to Western audiences, they were on the gamut. I mean, it was hard to find people, objecting to uh, those
It was social. It
victims.
was what are you talking
Yeah,
about? Israel was socialist.
yeah,
It was
yes,
a socialist paradise. That's how it was sold.
that's right. Yeah.
Populated by Eastern European, Soviet.
Kibbutzim. Yeah, yes,
Yeah,
yes,
I
yes.
mean, so that's the old Israel. That's how it was sold to the West.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah.
And then we have the turn of the century, and it's characterized by. So first we have the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, obviously, which is a watershed moment. And then we know that whatever had been agreed on 1993, the Oslo Accord, was on life support. And sure enough, layers by layers, the whole architecture of those discussions became completely moot. And then we have the provocation by Ariel Sharon in September 2000 on the esplanade of Al-Aqsa. This leads to the second Intifada, and I would argue that we've been in a spiral of violence ever since. And so 10 years later, what we see under um, a government headed by, I think it was Netanyahu already, again, I would say again, because it's been prime minister so many times. And he, out of this yet new assembled coalition of far rightists, increasingly more to the right, to the point that today we have religious rights, messianic eschatologists, individuals characterizing the current cabinet. But back in 2010, we had Avigdor Lieberman, and Avigdor Lieberman was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And in December of that year, he invited all those populist parties from Europe to Jerusalem, and they were given a tour of the Knesset, and they were given the Grand Tour. And this is when we witnessed this kind of great reversal of alliance. Israel, up to that point, and always in the West, via its lobbies and its antenna and its chapters, advocated for open borders and
Yes.
tolerance, right? And suddenly, with the war on terror simultaneously becoming this kind of all-pervasive narrative imposed upon us in the wake of 9/11, and all the change of mood in the airport and all those, this alienating sets of procedures to take a goddamn plane. You got to go and show up 4 hours prior to your plane taking off, and undergo all kind of frankly ridiculous. I mean, it sounds like this kind of rituals of the humiliation in a way, you know. And so this is the moment where, yeah, that the Huntington paradigm completely prevailed over the Fukuyama, the end of history and the new man. No, history was reasserting itself with a vengeance. This parenthesis of the 1990s, at least in the West, we asked the Russians what the 1990s were, they were anything but a panacea. But in the West, there was this kind of interregnum where political, geopolitical issues were relegated to the back burner, and it was all about the rise of the internet and those dot-com fortunes and those silly, I remember, yeah, this era as somewhat of a silliness, a lot of silliness. But looking back, we almost feel nostalgic because when we look at what we have today, a lot of people are very nostalgic in the West of the 1990s. But back then, and you mentioned a very interesting expression with the peace dividends. Remember how they sold us the peace dividends, under the Clinton years? And yes, there were some closure. There were some the budget. Some of the budgets were decreased, but by and large, I don't think we remotely explored what could have been those peace dividends. And so to me, that this was never. It was a fleeting moment, and in the West, we were so. Of course, we all remember those images of the Berlin Wall collapsing and people just flowing to the West. And we used to say at the time, describing the process of the Eastern Bloc falling apart. It took like 10 years for Poland, 10 months for Germany, 10 weeks for Czechoslovakia, and 10 days for Romania. And so a lot of us at the time, before internet, were completely uh, bewitched by this. And it took a long time for people to start turning the page on this sequence, a sequence that started, I would say, with the December 1987 intermediary peace, missile treaties, the INF treaties signed in Washington between Gorbachev and Reagan, all the way to the bombardment of the Russian parliament in 1993 under Yeltsin, and by then a very deconsidered Yeltsin already. And we're talking about a mere 2 years after his seminal standing on that tank in August '91. So, but that's a long time. That's like 5 to 6 years, and during those 5 to 6 years, I think a lot of people kind of lost the plot. But the actors behind the scenes were retooling, regrouping, hatching new plans, and we just were completely unaware of it until that fateful day on that fateful Tuesday morning on 9/11, where uh, the party was over, I guess. And but in that time, in that sense, uh, those forces that we're seeing today, raging, they were preparing themselves. They were positioning themselves. The old agendas were as current and relevant as ever before. We just completely lost track of that. We were treated to some kind of illusion, I guess, to our own detriment. And I don't think we've ever recovered from that era in a way. We're still trying to get our bearings. And to mention Naomi Klein, at the same time, they're moving constantly on the shock, using the shock doctrine. They keep, installing new paradigm now with increasingly shorter time lapses, and we're just we're struggling to keep our barely our head out of the water, to be honest. But if you talk about the EU as a step to globalism, to the one world government that they've been selling to us, this kumbaya party, a lot of those far right parties emerged in opposition to the policies advocated by an unelected, bureaucratic, apparatchik-like system in embodied by the European Commission. And but where they the problem is because they were trying to get legitimacy because historically their ideas had been discredited, and how much and how dramatically they had been discredited. They were willing to somehow tie the knot with the most modern or the last vestige, the last remnants of uh, uh, authoritarian, ethnically oriented state in the world today, colonial state. You know, uh, it's an aberration. It's this. It has no, in a way, it defies the mind that such a state could still exist today, and yet here we are. But those parties, again, to be able to exist, they signed a pact with the devil. They espoused the conflict of civilization narrative, and they fed from it, and they carried out, in so doing, they carried out some of the diabolical Machiavellian policies hatched in Tel Aviv in trying to create, to export the Israeli-Palestinian conflict worldwide, at least in the West, to be sure. And people like Huntington played in that. They were the scribes. They fanned the flame, and then the neocons, obviously, a lot of them, even though they came from the left, they somewhat embraced this narrative as well. Although they couched it in the terms like democratic revolution. We all remember that 2005 inauguration speech of George Bush during at the onset of his second term, and the speech was written by, if I believe, by Max Boot. Was it Max Boot who wrote that speech?
Not
Not
sure.
sure. Oh, David Frum. David Frum. Yes, David Frum, Canadian. But he was a fellow traveler of those guys, and yeah, it was all about from exporting from the permanent revolution of the 1917 1921 of the Bolshevik, of the Trotskyite persuasion. They retooled themselves and exported democracy, and this is what we've been seeing the last 25 years in the Middle East, essentially.
Yeah, the neocons are all ex, failed Trotskyites or successful Trotskyites who managed to rebrand. But let's get back to the failure of left-right politics. So we took a little bit of a broader geopolitical diversion there, and I'll just backtrack a little bit. So the main organizing principle of the left in the 20th century is around labor unions. And
Yes.
so those have been, for the most part, eviscerated for different reasons. Globalization, which you mentioned, being one of them. And it's important for people, at least I try to remind people, to delineate the difference between globalization and globalism. Globalization being using the world as a labor market to get comparative advantage for a better profit bottom line. So globalism being this, as you said, drift ideologically towards a one world government, Davos and the World Economic Forum being the think tank for this, and other international institutions, and it's really a transnational corporate one world government. So they're slightly different, but globalization delivered a lot of benefits for China, as you said, with their massive trade surplus, and a lot of benefits in standard of living in around the world, and including in the West as well. But it also coincided with the financialization of corporations and the markets in the West to point of massive asset stripping of Western companies as they offshored them. And this is best, I think, embodied in the great BBC documentary series called The Mayfair Set, that showed Jimmy Goldsmith, Mohammed Al Fayed, James Aspinall, Tiny Rowland, and these were the Jim Slater, I think his name was, the accountant, and that caught on in America, and that was the dismantling of British industry in order to achieve a bottom line on the stock market. So great for shareholder dividends,
Shareholders.
bad for local jobs. Same process in America. And with that, with the disappearance of labor unions, and that's a main component of the working class identification. The class identification was replaced with a corporate identification in the 80s, and people identified with products and lifestyles and LGBT and this, that, and the other, as opposed to identifying. So the class struggle was replaced with a materialist struggle and an identity politics paradigm. And so then, so the left just gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So the underlying values there. So then that left-right paradigm disappears. People have the illusion in the 90s of material wealth. They can buy a flat screen TV for $200. That was out of that was out of the range of anybody. And have a mobile phone with a computer stronger than the one that powered the space shuttle around the planet in everybody's pocket. And and through globalization, this gave a lift in the quality of life, the standard of living for the working class in terms of material items. Okay. But as you said, Arnaud, the super wealthy, the wealth gap was getting massive. And then now it's at levels that are just galactic and unbelievable. So now the paradigm is clearly becoming up versus down rather than left versus right. And there's a lot of confusion, I think, of people not realizing that this has taken place. This, I think, also the meaningless of, the name, the Labour Party in Britain, and you have, people like this gentleman here who's in charge of the Labour Party. There are no labor unions of any meaning left in the UK. And so you have somebody who's ostensibly far right or just borderline fascist in charge of the Labour Party. The Israelis have purged, Jeremy Corbyn and all the old leftists out and replaced them with this. This is so far right. So that if this is the left has shifted, the establishment have managed to shift the left all the way to the fringe of the right. And so the paradigm has moved. And I think that's part of the confusion, Arnaud, is that people don't realize, how far to the right, or the old, what used to be calculate the right of the old paradigm, that the current Democrats and Labor parties, for instance, are sitting in. They're massive corporatists. They're the huge pro-defense, pro-war. All of these issues that used to define the old left have completely been jettisoned by the likes of this. And so we have Farage, the insurgent supposedly conservative party. I don't think he's going to make it to the general election personally. Then you have this, and then you have this in France, again, appealing to the working class, with the immigration issue being one of the main motivators, the emotional trigger that is fueling this, along with the standard of living in France, the inflation issue. And then you have this. These are the Frederick Merz, Germany, Chancellor, BlackRock, longtime employee. You have this actor in France, Emmanuel Macron. I guess he works for the Rothschild banking cartel. You have Zelensky. He is the sort of mascot for the European project at the moment, and all the neoliberal values, democracy, etc. Starmer, and then you have, I think that's Donald Tusk there from Poland. That's New Europe, according to Condoleezza Rice. And so this is the current state. I honestly, I think the quality of the political leadership has never been lower in Europe, because I don't think people who have any brains or any serious ambition in life are going in, or skilled people, or people, they're not going into politics. Politics is just getting the leftovers, the ruthless bureaucrats and social climbers and people who, some of the most corrupt people, of course, are going, from a white collar point of view anyway, going into politics. You're not getting anyone who wants to serve their country and has any of those old left or right value sets, Arnaud. And we're left with this. This is what we're left with. This is what we're getting right now. Your thoughts on this? So it's really why is the left right system collapsed? And this is what we have right now. So it's not appealing to a lot of young people. So its audience is shrinking, is what you're saying.
Well, I would argue that the classical politician has disappeared today in favor of the managerial class. And this is what globalism is all about. It's about administrating what is presented as scarce resources, so that, and the same thing with elections. I mean, it was Klaus Schwab himself who uh, offered up the notion that every election was pretty much decided in advance and it would be actually better that way. And those people pretend to know what's best and micromanage our lives. But in fact, it's the way you describe this funneling of incredible wealth from the middle class, what used to be making those, the West, the West, which was a robust middle class. You mentioned the Great Society. The Great Society actually never saw the light of day. They chose war. That's why they whacked JFK, so that there would not be a Great Society. Lyndon Johnson paid it lip service for a few months, but next thing you know, we were in Vietnam, up to the gazoo, and so the Great Society was really a fleeting, you know, notion. But yeah, this is in JFK's opening, or one of the speeches, seminal speeches he made about a robust middle class, with a large, very large surface. This is what ensures prosperity and a quality education. Because you mentioned, people don't know, don't understand, because under the new neoliberal policies starting in the late 70s, early 80s, and the rise of the corporate state. And I think it was Chris Hedges who referred to it as the corporatocracy, which I think, I mean, it's a kind of cumbersome word, but it pretty much sums up, where we're living in. It's not a democracy; it's a corporatocracy, and it's never more better illustrated than this Citizen United Supreme Court ruling, which now allows corporations to exercise their right to free speech through the financing of elections.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where now we're dealing. I just saw Scott Reader today, and he was talking about trying to explain democracy in America to a Russian person in the audience, who was asking, what is democracy? And he started from the bottom down, the board of supervisors, superintendent. At this level, democracy works, yes. But all the way to the county level, even maybe the state, as soon as you reach the state level and above, this is not democracy anymore. It's a game where if you don't have, let's talk about the presidency, if anything, $200 million at least in your coffers, you don't stand a chance. So this is the state of affairs now. Obviously, in Europe, the scales are much lower in terms of campaign finance, but still, it's those are very large sums of money, to such extent that someone like Sarkozy, whom people have rumored the backing of intelligence agencies in the United States for a long time
Mm-hmm.
before he even ran for office, he had to actually go get some money, in Libya.
But
And when the this letter to come out, somehow,
Gaddafi, yeah.
agendas juxtaposed each other. He was given basically, a free reign to settle the score, so he would never reimburse the guy. And at the same time, at the level of the globalist, destroying one of the few well-administered state, the wealthiest African state at the time, who was so wealthy not only for his own constituents but also for the continent because there were a lot of projects that were in the works,
It was socialist.
satellites.
Gaddafi
Yeah,
modeled hit after a Soviet. He was a Stalinist,
that's right. That's right.
basically.
So
Yeah.
was Bashar al-Assad.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What?
The Ba'athist. Yeah,
That's
the
right.
Ba'athist government. So on that front, the money, the money being injected into Europe now, that's forming this new European political landscape, is coming from America. And you have people like Alex Karp, Peter Thiel, but they have an interest in the outcome for their businesses, you see. So you have this merger of corporate and state interests here that can only be described as fascism. And then,
That's the classical definition of fascism. That's right.
and then here, and this guy, Arnaud, and this guy at the AFD
Oh, yeah.
rally. So
Yeah, that's
Elon
right.
Musk is very active in either trying to oust British politicians. He's attacked Farage. He's attacked Starmer. He somehow wants an outcome in British politics, and his colleagues like Alex Karp and Peter Thiel want outcomes in Germany and Britain as well. And so they're backing all of these media outlets. They're pumping money into YouTube influencers. They're directly into politics. They're creating third-party spin-offs like Advance UK to split votes. There's a lot going on here, Arnaud. There's a lot of money that's being pumped in here by some of these technocrats and tech bros. And so this is about a revolution in government. When I say revolution, I mean the change from social democracies to technocracies. And these guys
That's
want
right.
to deliver the backbone to it. That to me is one of the biggest things that is transformative in America too. In America, Doge firing all these government employees, automating these systems, bringing in AI. That's what's going on now, but it's not really being talked about. It's not a central point of discussion. It's just happening in the background, Arno. And we're talking billions that are being pumped into this.
Yeah, I guess you are alluding to what has now has increasingly been comes to be known as the dark enlightenment, the dark lights, les lumières noires. This is how the Peter Thiel crowd characterizes, their sets of policies, and basically, yeah, they want to jettison the democratic process, and they want an authoritarian, vertical way of decision making without dealing with all kind of intermediaries or intermeddlers even. And by virtue of their financial surface and the technology, the new technology that they marshal, they think that by flattering some the most basic instinct, blaming, progressists, or blaming foreigners, or blaming Karens, or blaming what have you, uh, they might just be able to impose a new paradigm. And I must say that when we look at the trend, I would say the last 25, 30 years, which saw a lot of disenfranchised workers, the victims of disindustrialization, a lot of them now are all encarted in those far right parties. Same happened in France, where all the members of the Communist Party of old, which used to register 25% in the first round of presidential elections and parliamentary elections, 90% of them moved to the National Rally, or the Front National at the time, before it became the National Rally. But that's where they are. The petits blancs, the little whites, the the, basically all those blue collar working class who feel that they don't want, their slogan is you will not replace us, essentially. We're not going to fade away in the night, in a way.
So
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 that's
ha,
a very
so
important and very dangerous elixir. And you've got those guys, the tech bros, as you mentioned, who are, basically showering those parties with large sums of monies, for some reason, allowing, the censorship is not does not apply it that much, and some of the rhetorics that some of those parties get to peddle, because obviously they have common interest. I mean, and it's the slow implementation of an authoritarian model based on no nonsense managerial of resources. I mean, now we have, abortion is completely this. Abortion almost looks like, uh, a walk in the park. Now we have laws that allows people to be sedated for good because they're useless or they cost too much to the state. This is where we are now. We have the GPA, gestation pour autrui, which allows a woman to rent a uterus, living on somebody else's misery and financial despair situation. So, so to the extent conservatism used to at least be a beacon of moderation and, place some kind of limits as to what could be done, especially with the human body, this has completely gone out of the window and is advocated today by Jeremy Bentham or inspired political thinkers and their avatars in the political scene. It's okay.
So
It's become completely
so
normalized.
tell me what's the appeal to migrate from what used to be the far left to the national rally, for instance. What is the mechanism here? What is the appeal? Is it because they think that they're going to get things done? They want to be that this is where the progress is happening, or this is they see it as iconoclastic? What is the appeal? How do you do it? 'Cause we saw that with the disaffected Bernie Sanders supporters fleeing to MAGA
Yeah.
with Trump. So can you tell me how is this mechanism? What's the appeal? How does this work?
Well, I think there are two elements that we should take into consideration. The first element is basically that the very people who are financing those parties these days, they are the one responsible for bringing what is known in Marxist thinking as the lumpen proletariat. Those people, at some point, they were getting too revendicative. They were asking, may think thinks you are complaining too much, type of, And you mentioned the syndicates and trade unions, and those people were getting, the owners of capitals. They were basically growing tired of this. So, in the name of progressive, that's the insidious part of it. In the name of progress, they opened the borders and they brought first, workers who were supposed to go home after the contract was over. But then in the 1970s, throughout the Western world, there were laws where families could be reunited. So they would bring families over and then they would have kids. But at the same time, we never try to assimilate them or integrate them in a way where they could be part of the national fabric. We relegated them into some kind of ghetto. And until what was supposed to happen happened, it bowled over. One generation and a half later, those who had been born there completely uprooted from their origins and at the same time not completely assimilated into the new culture. So this is how you create anomy. So this pretty much has been a cut and paste, across the board scenario throughout the West. That very class of predators has created the conditions and vilified at the same time the traditional working class, from those countries, to such an extent that there's a lot of resentment because they couldn't express their frustration. They were demonized, and 40 years, 50 years later, because the agenda requires it, it's the old divide to conquer. You're allowing those autochtones, those natives, to come out of the reservation and point out, the source of their of their condition, I guess, and it's okay now. They can go now. There are a lot of other agendas, just like we mentioned international Zionism that also serves uh, this ideology to allow because they're looking new allies. I mean, they've lost the left. The left is you know th-
Well,
there's no way.
it's a clash of civilizations.
Yeah, it is. It
It's
is.
Christianity versus Islam. It's Western values versus
Yeah,
Eastern
but
values. It's
Christianity, who practices
Judeo-Christian.
Christianity these days? That's the thing. I
It's
mean,
yeah,
the
it's a new.
moment you start scratching the surface, you realize that Christianity is what is Christianity today? Nobody goes to church. Nobody practices, except in some of the Protestant lands in America. But in Europe, nobody goes to churches. So
It's a shadow identity from the past. I mean,
yeah,
one would
for a whole
argue
slew of reasons. Yes,
the French kind of killed it. Well, they replaced it with the French nationalism as a religion replaced Catholicism after the French Revolution. One would argue. So that was a process that began in Europe in its heart, and I think that just replicated itself right across the West over the next
yeah,
150
materialism,
years.
consumerism became the
Yes,
new god.
that was the next wave after that, and etc. Identity politics, like
Shopping center, the mall became the new church. I mean, every family
yeah,
congregated on weekends and spent the entire weekend in the mall. You
yes.
could do everything in the mall. You have the food courts, you have the cinema, you have the boutiques, you have the atrium. So it's a kind of a distorted iteration of the old Greek agora, except
Mm.
that everybody's got a credit card or two or three or four. It's free money. That's how it's presented to them, and everybody shops and everybody drinks and eats junk food and consumes, somewhat, questionable Hollywood content. It's a dumbing down. Yeah,
But that church is being demolished by Amazon and by the virtual
exactly.
agora, the virtual agora. So in America, those malls are being like they're completely empty, desolate, many
It's
of them.
interesting that you would mention that because I watched a program yesterday, a French program, and basically they were doing the autopsy of businesses in France. I mean, malls after malls after malls are completely empty. 90% of the boutiques for rent, for sale.
Mm.
You know,
Same,
it's
yeah.
yeah, and they use the COVID lockdown to eradicate all the little guys, all the little players. For a while, they insensitized them to stay home to be safe by giving them free money. But there's no free money. You have to reimburse it.
Oh, that
In the
accelerated.
meantime,
It definitely
yes,
accelerated, and these
yeah,
guys profited off it like unbelievably.
completely. Oh yeah,
Jeff Bezos, all of
yes,
these tech lords, and they occupy the key positions in Bilderberg now. What used to be old industry, oil, ThyssenKrupp Steel, the captains of old industry, they and banking, and they dominate. Now it's Zuckerberg, Microsoft, Thiel, Carp. They run
that's
Bilderberg.
it.
So that's the transatlantic corporate steering committee for this new corporate state,
That's right.
and it's been like this noticeable since 2010, 2011, 2012, but now we're seeing the results of it finally, and and a lack of engagement politically increasingly by generation Z, the young generation, more and
Gen
more
Z.
alienated, feeling of disenfranchisement, feeling that it's irrelevant, and that this gap between the boomer class that can maybe are fluent in the language we're speaking a lot about here, dialectical materialism and so forth, and and traditional conservatism and things like that, that populated the traditional left and traditional right, gone, gone, and they'll be gone. They'll be extinct very soon. And so there's nothing coming into the void in terms of politics. Just to bring it back full circle, Arnaud, because we're going to wrap it up. This is obviously a bigger conversation than we have time for. But back to the single party state, they're getting things done. So then there's this liberal democracy versus the single party autocracy. And that's the fight that we're supposedly fighting in geopolitics with the West versus everybody else, is a democracy versus dictatorships and so forth. That's replaced capitalism and communism as the sort of rallying cry for the geopolitical crusade. But that's this is the future debate that's now happening even in the West, as they're weighing up the utility of the liberal democracy in intellectual centers. Arnaud, final thoughts on this, because that's kind of where a lot of the conversation is drifting right now. But just, we're going to wrap it up in a couple minutes. I'll just give you the floor for the final few minutes, but go ahead, Arnaud.
No, you touched upon it. I mean, it's now the culture of uniformity, conformism, dumbing down the lowest common denominator. Look at the brands. I mean, the brands, we all know who they are today. They are all they're all part of the investment funds that I mentioned earlier. And it's become so ridiculous these days that if we were to resume sum up what the stock market is all about these days, is those three investment funds selling and buying each other's shares and creating the illusion through the volume that the economy is doing well, when in fact the real economy, the one that we can see with our own eyes, is being eviscerated in front of us. So at the geopolitical level, yes, you're right. It is the ultimate version of fascism. Fascism, almost in the most classical sense, with demagogues and crazies and buffoons placed in all the key spots, basically churning out nonsense from morning to night. And behind them, you have this kind of cold, technocratic, all-pervasive surveillance system, which aims to tell you how many times a year you can take a plane because of the carbon footprint, whether or not you're up to date with your vaccines, whether or not you're going to get your full allocation in terms of the electronic currency, to the extent you might have published a tweet that goes against the grain. This is what we have on one side of the world, and then on the other side we have the multipolar world. Those countries who have just recently come into their own as economic players, military powers, and we don't want to be swallowed up within the Leviathan. They don't want to be replaced, as it were. They know that it's their turn, because it's the wheels of history, and this is the next stage. And you're going to have a great reservation. The West is going to be turned into a great, gigantic electronic gulag, where it will be extremely difficult to envision a better future for yourself, not to mention for your kids, versus the other side. And that's why they have to. I'm talking about the Leviathan. They need to create not only an enemy because their internal contradictions are so visible for everyone. At least the most uneducated person feels it in its daily life that something is drastically wrong. So they need to create this existential threat from outside, but at the same time, they aim to, at some point, if they get the chance, extend their dominion over the whole planet. It all comes down to George Orwell. How do you envision the future of humanity? With a boot on my face forever. I mean, at least this is ultimately what the game plan is all about.
It seems
unless we can stop it.
like that's digitally, it's hard to avoid that conclusion, Arnaud. Digitally speaking, it's a tremendous amount of power, and that goes for China and everybody else. It's
yes, because that's very good point you make, is that people think the new world order is limited to the West. No. There are several new world orders. They're just competing with each other to find out which one will prevail ultimately, or whether or not they will, for the time being, satisfy themselves with some regional sphere of influence. But the new world order is the preserve. It's not the exclusive preserve of any of those regional center of powers. Far from it.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the drive to balkanize the global communication space, global economies, because everything cannot be harmonized globally at the moment. So they're going to balkanize and do it by region, and that's absolutely frightening, as we've seen this, especially with the digital ID being one of the main components of this, foundational components of this type of a technocratic system, something that we're opposing on very strong grounds, by the way. So, but the arguments are countervailing with traditional post-enlightenment values and liberties and rights and freedoms, and things like this, and libertarian values of volunteerism and so forth. All of these are now potentially going to be shelved, all of these types of arguments, in favor of technological solutions to problems
Social
that,
Darwinism.
yeah,
Yes.
to
It's
problems
social
that don't
Darwinism.
exist,
Yeah.
to problems that don't exist. Certainly they don't exist for us, but they seem to exist at a corporate level in terms of efficiency and bottom lines. So
Oh, yes.
that's kind of where we're being herded at the moment. Listen, Arnaud, we are just really scratching the surface of some really big issues here. But I really appreciate opening up this conversation. Hopefully we can continue this conversation. I think by looking at some of our listener feedback already, and we didn't have time to share some of the comments with you, but there's an interest here. And so let's continue this conversation going forward. Arnaud Develay, political consultant, international human rights lawyer, based in Moscow at the moment. Arnaud, thank you so much for joining us on the Midweek Wire this week.
Thank you, Patrick. Always a pleasure.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Arnaud Develay. You can find Arnaud's work up at 21stcenturywire.com. We've got a link on the show page to his archive as well. Folks, this is just the beginning, possibly, of more discussions on this. Definitely, I want to invite Arnaud back to expound on some of these points and delve into some of these areas. Obviously, our time is limited in this format. I think we gave it a pretty good crack in an hour and 20 minutes, but we could do a little more in future. We might just do that. We might even do that sooner than later, possibly next week or the week after. It's such an important discussion. We'll also prepare our audiovisual game on this topic a little more, as well as we explore it further. But anyway, that's the program for the Midweek Wire. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And if you like what we do, if you like the Sunday Wire, the Midweek Wire, our daily intelligence briefs and reports at 21stcenturywire.com, which are stunning right now. We have a great team that we've assembled, but all of this is very expensive, and we need your support to keep it going. Just with the security details that we've had to deal with recently, and Cloudflare, everybody saw what happened to Cloudflare this past week. We also have to field these types of situations on a weekly and monthly basis, and we need your help as well to support this media platform, as well as our sort of multiple channels that we're managing on the audiovisual side with 21st Century Wire. We are managing multiple platforms, 7 or 8 platforms, and we will need to add a few more as well. So donate or subscribe and become a member at 21wire.tv. That's one way you can help us. Even a little bit goes a long way with an operation like this. We've been bootstrapping it so long, we're incredibly efficient. So again, anything you can do to support us as a subscriber or a donor, we really absolutely really appreciate it. And there's different ways that you can do that. You can do that anonymously if you want to, using cryptocurrency, or through the various other methods we've got here on our support page, donate page on our main homepage, upper gold button. You can get us there. But that's all we've got time for today. It's been great having you. And again, great deep discussion here on politics and the future of politics as we once knew it. We'll see going forward what that's going to mean. But anyway, for now, it's been great having you for the Midweek Wire. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. Take care, everybody. All the best.